Years ago, we lived in a home, and around the backyard was a brown fence. And after living there several years, I realized this fence needs to be painted. So uh, our two daughters lived at home during that time, so that was our summer project. We were painting that fence. And I think we got by for about 6, 7 years, and it needed to be painted again. And the problem the second time around was my daughters were in college. And so I painted that fence for a last time. And it was after that I thought we're moving to a condo, which we have done. But one of those days when I was out there painting the fence, I was wearing sunglasses. So my regular glasses I set on our back patio table. The table was glass, and the sun was full that day. And with that full sun beating down upon that glass and reflecting up onto the lens of my glasses and all of the heat involved in that, what I didn't realize was happening during that day was that the lenses were being distorted. So at the end of the day, I took my sunglasses off, put on my regular glasses, and I could not see. Now, every day, almost every day, I will clean my lenses because there'll be a smudge. And I can look around that smudge and manage. But I could not manage at all with that distorted lens. One of the major effects of childhood sexual abuse is that for the survivor, they get a distorted lens, a distorted perception and beliefs in regard to life. It's not just a smudge, it's a distortion. A survivor's worldview becomes distorted regarding sexuality, regarding manhood, regarding God, regarding fatherhood. And so let me break it down into a few subpoints here, what this distortion is about. The distorted lens that they have to view through will distort how they interpret life overall. In the 1970s, there was an incredible amount of research being done regarding childhood sexual abuse and its effects. And these observations that were being made through the research had been noted decades earlier but had been ignored, but then brought to the surface again in the 70s. Further research was done in the 1990s. It's interesting, if you were to go looking for books on childhood sexual abuse, you would find that many were written in the 70s or written in the 90s. That doesn't mean that there haven't been some good books written in the 2000s, but a lot more publishing going on in those years because of the research. And in the 1990s, here's what researchers were finding. That childhood sexual abuse resulted in manifestations, symptoms that were similar to those experienced by Vietnam War veterans. And the sexual abuse could be described then as a traumatic event. Today, post-traumatic stress disorder is recognized among clinicians for childhood sexual abuse survivors. The worldview of a war veteran is changed. The worldview of a survivor of childhood sexual abuse is changed. Now, there's a couple of ways in which their interpretation of life is distorted. One is that their sense of safety is compromised. The world is not a safe place. And this is where I want to introduce this term hypervigilance. If you're not able to remember it, don't worry about it. But hypervigilance involves this rapid scan of a situation, which then narrows to a highly focused level of attention of any potential threat that exists. I'm hyper vigilant of the dangers that are out there, being constantly on guard, looking through my lens, scanning the environment of any potential dangers. Whenever a group of people walks into a room to find where they're going to sit for a particular session, everybody kind of has their favorite type of place where they sit. But a survivor enters the room, scans, and looks for what they interpret to be the safe place. It might be the place near the door. It might be the place that's out of view of anyone else. It would be different for different survivors. I refer to it as just always having a high antenna to measure, am I safe? Because the world isn't. Survivors of abuse have an especially high antenna of certain men that need to be avoided. They can read the face. They can see it in the eyes. They saw it in their perpetrator. So the distortion of interpreting life can be about a sense of safety being compromised. Secondly, it can also be about this ability to trust, and that gets compromised. People, men, cannot be trusted. Now, God intends, this is God's intention. He would intend that children develop a sense of safety and security. So God gave children parents. Parents provide that safe environment. That's God's design. And the parent-child relationship is intended by God to set the foundation for trusting, healthy relationships in adulthood. But when the parent or some other caregiver violates that trust, the ability to trust is sabotaged even into adulthood. And that impairment affects a husband. A husband could be, let's say, consistently faithful to his wife. In fact, he may make all sorts of efforts to demonstrate that he's trustworthy, not in a manipulative manner, but just in a reassuring manner. But even with all of that, for some survivors, it would prove futile because they just cannot free themselves from this fear that their partner might otherwise prove untrustworthy someday. This is why in some literature, husbands of survivors are referred to as secondary survivors, because they too are dealing with the effects of the childhood sexual abuse. It's just a different life for a survivor. Constance Nightingale. It's a rather long quote, but let me share it with you here. As sexual abuse is the most unloving thing that can happen to a child, then love is the key to our healing. The love that is acceptance of the person we are. It's someone listening and believing, someone caring and understanding the complex mix of our emotions, someone accepting all the rage and the grief and the terror that we have concealed for so long, someone helping us to replace the old tape that told us we weren't worth anything, we're guilty and dirty, with a true new tape that speaks of our value, our innocence, and essential goodness, and of our ability to take control over our own lives and to trust ourselves and others. So we're looking overall here at this category of distorted beliefs and perceptions, and we've seen that this distorted lens affects how I interpret life, but the second main point here is that the distorted lens also affects how I view God. It especially affects how I view God. Because how is it that a loving God and childhood sexual abuse can coexist? How could that possibly be? Especially in the mind of a child or young adult. Is God trustworthy, really? How can you tell me God is trustworthy? Where was he? How can God look the other way when this is being done? God is either mean or, at the very least, he's uncaring. Ellen Dykus who I cited earlier, has a rich statement that helps me sort through this, and I think is the ultimate truth that a survivor needs to come to and take hold of. And that is that healing comes when the childhood sexual abuse can be interpreted through the character of our Redeemer rather than interpreting the character of our Redeemer through the childhood sexual abuse. There's a lens that we look through. And it takes a long road in most cases towards healing. Sometimes God grants the instantaneous healing. But I remember reading years ago from a psychologist and Professor Archibald Hart, who said, most often though, rather than granting the instantaneous healing, which seems like it takes a lot of faith, most often God chooses to take us on a long journey, because it's on that journey that he really grows our faith as we trust in him. And it's on that journey that as healing occurs, in God's gradual dispensing of that healing, it's on that journey that the survivor begins to see life not through the lens of the abuse, but through the lens of their Redeemer. Isn't denying the abuse, but it's allowing themselves to be embraced by a Redeemer who holds them in spite of that abuse. This is an important section to reflect upon, and so I urge you to go to the guidebook and as soon as you can, begin working through those questions. And do so, I trust as a person of faith, that you do so prayerfully. Ask God to reveal truth to you as you reflect. Remember, we deal with these distortions, so my prayer is that God, by his Holy Spirit, our God of truth, will lead you into truth as you reflect on this content.